going to become irrelevant. We're going to collapse as a civilization unless we make these changes.
Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is an historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s for LaRouche-Pac. That's LaRouchePac.com. And I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Good. Let's start off with what's happening today. Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, they're all at the G20 in Germany. And the corporate media was making a really big deal about this. Oh, they're going to meet. Are they going to shake hands? What's going to happen? And they finally met. Now, you're in that area, right? You're in Germany.
Well, in fact, I was going to head to Hamburg for the G20, and security people suggested it's not a good idea. And of course, what we're seeing there is one of the attempts to disrupt the conference is this deployment of these so-called anarchists, the Black Bloc or Antifa anarchists, to tear up the place. But I have got a report from one of my associates who is there, who was not at the, as you know, no one's at the Trump-Putin meeting, but the initial reports are quite interesting. And I think the important thing is the backdrop to this. There was such an effort to make sure this never happened. That's the whole reason for the Russia did it, Putin did it, Trump's colluding, Trump's obstructing justice. The whole thing was to create a circumstance where Trump could not follow through with his commitment to sit down with Putin and see if there can be areas of cooperation. And to his credit, they not only sat down together, but instead of 40 minutes or 30 minutes, it ended up being almost a 2-hour meeting. And according to Tillerson, they had a lot of good discussion. They worked through a lot of things. And I think this is so important because the ability to speak with someone like Putin, who has experience, who's been at the center of things, who's been under attack by the same people attacking Trump. They may have shared some of those experiences. And then to have it at the G20, where the media line is Trump is against everyone, everyone's against Trump, Trump is screwing up, he's an amateur, he doesn't know what he's doing. And then you have a situation where Xi Jinping just met with Putin, then Trump meets with Putin, Trump's going to meet with Xi Jinping. And the topic is really going to be, how do you fight terrorism? How do you deal with North Korea? And to a lesser extent, although it's a really important thing, what do you do about the economy? So this is a crucial meeting, and I'm very happy that it happened, and I think we're going to see some very significant implications from it, probably including more efforts to disrupt their relationship.
Yes, I agree. I think the corporate media, the deep state, they never wanted this to happen. They tried to stop this completely. And I think they were making a big deal that Trump was not going to bring up the Russian hacking. And he did have a discussion with Putin about the Russian hacking. He asked him questions, did Russia hack? And Putin gave him an answer, and Trump was satisfied with the answer that that he gave him. So
this is one of those, Dave, this is one of those strange questions. When did you stop beating your wife? Assuming that the lies were true and Putin was doing it, what was he going to do? Say, yeah, I did it. We did it. We got you elected. Now you're my guy and you're going to do what I say. I mean, the reality here is that this was a whole staged operation, and it was to prevent the breakout of the old system. And Putin gave a speech the other day when Xi Jinping was there, and what Putin said, which was interesting, is that the old system doesn't work. It's falling apart. The relationships don't work. The old geopolitics, the East versus West, North versus South, all of this is breaking down, and we're looking for new modalities. And that's, of course, why Trump got elected, because people were tired of regime change wars. They were tired of being lied to and being treated by a bunch of arrogant fools as though their lives had no meaning. And Trump came along and said, I'm going to try and do these things. Now, whether he can or not is another question. Whether he's up to it, whether he's given too much leeway to the neocons inside his administration, these are all questions that we have to see. But the fact that he had this meeting. He looked at Putin and said, "Did you do it?" And Putin said no, and Trump said, "Okay, I think that's a good answer." And I think it's most likely 99.9% true, because as we now know, the only ones who said they had evidence were the British, who passed it on to the three stooges, to Comey, Clapper, and Brennan. And their three agencies, not 17 intelligence agencies, but those three agencies, which were part of the Obama confrontation with China and Russia and the support for Hillary. That was Hillary's support group. They were the ones who cooked up this whole scenario. So hopefully that's going to be laid to rest. I don't think it will. I don't think the deep state will let up. But the fact that Trump went ahead with the meeting and did what he did, I think is very significant.
Yes, so do I. And you brought up North Korea and what is happening out there. And we understand that North Korea, they tested this ballistic missile. Now, do we have actual evidence that it was a ballistic missile? Do we have the actual data? Well, the U.S. is saying it was, but I'm personally not too sure. We haven't really seen the evidence or the data that it actually was a ballistic missile. Actually, I believe that Russia asked the United States to include the data in their UN draft to show that it was a ballistic missile. Because we know that Russia, the US, they're all tracking it. But what I find very interesting about this is that China and Russia, working together, came out with a step-by-step approach to calming the situation down in North Korea.
And I think what they proposed will make sense, because what are you going to do? This whole argument that China is not cracking down enough with sanctions and they're not cutting off food supplies. What happens if you have a poor, starving country and you cut off food supplies? Is that going to make them more willing to talk to you as friends? I mean, it's a provocation. The Chinese and the Russians are right about that. You need some sweeteners in the thing. And you need to talk to them and let them know, we're not going to let you get away with this, but we are going to give you a way out. And I think that's what Putin and Xi Jinping were talking about. Now, there's some of the neocons, some of the military types, and of course the British and some others who want these confrontations. It wouldn't matter to them if 1 million South Koreans were killed, if the U.S. hit their nuclear sites and in the meantime 1 million people in South Korea and several million in Japan were killed. That's collateral damage. It doesn't matter to them. But I hope the president has a chance to discuss this through with Putin and Xi Jinping. And, you're dealing with something that's uncertain. The North Koreans certainly seem to be complete lunatics. But on the other hand, we had certain processes in motion before 2000 that looked like they were being effective, and it was all cut off by Bush Jr. So you never really know in this situation. You have to be careful. But I think the Russians and the Chinese have more ability to intervene effectively than Trump by rattling sabers. So let's see what comes out of the discussions they have in Hamburg.
And one thing I just want to say, you would think that China and Russia would be the most worried, except for South Korea, because they border North Korea. The United States does not.
But you realize, of course, those areas are not exactly population centers for Russia and China. But you're right. Look, the more important thing is, can we get out of a world in which geopolitics dominates, in which you approach things with a tit-for-tat approach? You do this, then we're going to do that. Those policies don't work. That's why we've had endless wars in the Middle East. That's why we had the 2 world wars in the 20th century. And I think what Xi Jinping initiated with the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is an idea of how do you get above geopolitics, and this idea that development is the new name for peace. Can we come up with economic policies that are mutually beneficial so that it's in the interests of two potential enemies that each other succeeds economically? And this is something that, of course, the people in the military-industrial complex, the people who are the big supporters of the Israelis, the supporters of the Saudis, the ones who depend on contracts for consultants and mercenary armies and things of that sort, they don't want to see this. They're perfectly happy with the status quo in which there's a danger of large numbers of casualties. But for human civilization to survive, we have to break the power of those maniacs. And this is what a lot of people had hoped Trump would do. And I have to say, so far, Dave, I'm not convinced that he's up to the task of taking these neocons and breaking their backs. There are too many of them still around the administration, people like Frank Gaffney and Cohen Watnick, and working through Jared Kushner, the Mnuchins and people like that. There are too many of those guys around. But I think if Trump wants to break their power, the way to do it would be in an alliance with the Russians, the Chinese. And I think if he really forges that, then I think the Germans and others will come on board.
I do agree with you that, he is trying to do this. And there are a lot of those individuals still in government that are part of the deep state, the neocons, and whatever other factions there are within the government.
Yeah, a lot of Bush and Obama holdovers.
Yeah. The thing is, I think when he first came into the White House and he started writing all these executive orders, because really, what else can he really do except, write executive orders? I think he tried, and I think he thought it was like, a corporation where he was the CEO and he can just say, okay, this is what's going to happen, that's going to happen. And I think he realized, well, wait a minute, it doesn't work that way here. There's too many individuals that have been around for so long. They're so intertwined within government that I just can't do this. It's not going to work. And I think he's taking a different approach now, where he needs to shift things around. And I kind of see him doing this very slowly, because he did make an announcement, which I thought was very interesting, with Abe, Moon Jae-in at the G20, where all three of them said that the neighbors of North Korea should handle this problem. And who are the neighbors? China, Russia.
Yeah.
They're really the border states of. So I think he's trying to push that over to those two areas with their plan. Now, I don't think he can come out and say, listen, I would like Russia to handle this, because the corporate media would have been like all over him. So I think he does this in a way where he kind of manipulates what he wants without people realizing what he's really doing. Because he did say he doesn't have red lines. He doesn't talk like a deep state person. We're going in or out. He doesn't talk like that.
And I'll tell you, a couple of the executive orders in the beginning were really significant. The break with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, throwing that out. Now, the question then is the follow-through on these things. And you do run up against a bureaucracy. You run up against, he's got problems in his own party. The Republican Party is not going to go along with an infrastructure plan if it costs any money. Well, how do you build infrastructure without spending money? The question is, can you make the credit conditional upon increasing the overall productivity of the economy? And you can do that, but the Republicans won't let that happen. And of course, the Democrats aren't going to let them do anything, because the two parties essentially are two sides of the same coin. Now, I think where he got a little bit burned was two things. One is on the Bannon question. And I don't know whether he really handled that very well, the whole attack on Bannon. And then secondly, when he fired Comey, and everyone seemed to turn against him. Comey should have been fired, and he should fire Mueller. Mueller, you want to talk about conflict of interest? Mueller is a long-term crony of Comey's. They both come from Wall Street networks. They work together before the FBI, in the FBI. Both of them were involved in covering up for the U.S. role in supporting terrorism under Bush and Obama. They were the ones who implemented a major part of the NSA surveillance state. So I think this is where Trump needs to do the presidential pulpit and get out there and say, look, this is not an honest guy. He's not a straight shooter. He was put in there to destroy my presidency. And here's what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to let this guy destroy the presidency, and I want you to support me. Now, I think that would probably work, but a halfway measure and using tweets as a substitute for addressing the American people, it's just not going to work.
I think he just has to come out and do whatever he possibly can. Of course, the corporate media is going to go crazy over all this. The Democrats are going to go crazy over all this, and they're going to make it like he's trying to hide something. You know, this is what they do.
It's a question of whether you have death by 1,000 cuts or you go out swinging. And if you go out swinging, you might win. But if you allow them to keep nicking you, at some point you're going to lose too much blood to fight back. And, we're already at a point where his presidency in terms of domestic policy has gone nowhere. The repeal of Obamacare, the so-called tax cuts, the infrastructure plan, it's gone nowhere. And that's partly due to his own party's problem. But where he is making a difference is strategically. Let me give you an example that I think most people don't get. When he went to that NATO meeting a month and a half ago, and the media said it was terrible, Trump was disrespected, he disrespected Europe, nothing was done, it was a disaster. Well, shortly after the French elections, what did Macron do? He said, Putin's a good guy, I want to work with Putin, we need to get rid of the sanctions. Russia's not the problem, terrorism's the problem. Now that was the French president that the media was saying was so hateful toward Trump. He actually turned around and started talking about the things Trump said the Europeans should do. So, the idea that somehow we're isolated and no one's going to support what the United States is doing with Trump in office, it's not true. And similarly, changing the rules of globalization away from these corporate cartels governing trade to actually having nation states function on behalf of their citizens. That's popular in Europe right now. Marine Le Pen couldn't pull it off because you had a whole series of complications in France, including probably some vote fraud and some sabotage in her own party. But it's still popular, the idea that you're not going to allow bureaucrats in Brussels to tell your country what to do. There's a tremendous rebellion in Italy right now because of the shutting down of banks and the partial bail-ins and bailouts. 3 banks in the last 10 days. So to the extent that Trump can put forward a clear picture of what he wants to do and fight for it, I think he's got a chance not just of surviving, but of becoming known as a good or even great president. If he succumbs to the pressure and the pressure on him to moderate, to move to the center, to work with the Nancy Pelosi's and the Steny Hoyers, the country's finished. It's not just Trump's presidency, it's the country that will suffer.
And you mentioned the banks closing in Europe, and you mentioned, Trump's policies. When we look at what is happening here in the United States with the economy and also the global economy, from my viewpoint, I don't see anything going well whatsoever. I mean, we look at retail, housing, the GDP numbers, corporate default. I mean, it's just a complete and utter mess. And the Fed is out there saying that everything's fine.
Look, you're right. You look at things such as auto loans. You look at GM starting to cut back its employment again. You look at the delinquency rates of credit cards and the personal debt, the corporate debt, the student debt. $14 trillion in non-financial corporate debt. How's that ever going to be repaid? These phony stress tests that they just took as an example that the 30 big banks have enough regulatory capital. And then, of course, they announced afterwards that they were using American standards, which said that they have 14% reserves, whereas on international standards, it's around 6%, which is far below what's acceptable under the new banking laws. So nothing, you're right. And what's happening in Europe is that they're trying to figure out how to deal with the move away from quantitative easing, which means they're going to end up with a bunch of banks that are brain dead. And the debts of those banks are intermingled, and they can't be allowed to fall down. So there's going to have to be bailouts, bail-ins. The Monte dei Paschi Bank of Siena, which they just nationalized in Italy a couple of days ago, the senior stockholders, who were people who bought notes from the bank because they were making no money on their deposits. The bank convinced them they'd make more money on their deposits. They just got an 18% haircut. And that's just for starters. That was the bail-in. And then the government's got to come up with money, and the government of Italy is not allowed to spend on anything except bailouts. So it's a the economy's heading off a cliff, but it's going in slow motion.
The central banks right now, we have the ECB, the Fed. Now, the Fed, they're raising interest rates, and it looks like they're going to do it multiple times throughout this year. They're also talking about unwinding their balance sheet. And the ECB and others are saying, listen, we're going to, cut stimulus also. I mean, what is their plan here? Because we know that this whole entire economy has been kept alive from the stimulus.
Right. I don't know what their plan is, but it's not going to work because they're operating from an old playbook, which is based on the idea that if you don't have enough inflation, you have to goose up the inflation with the lower interest rates. And then when you get to the right temperature, then you can start raising rates again. But the economy is not some static bowl of soup. There's a dynamic that determines things such as inflation and jobs, and it changes. It changes over time, depending in part on what your manufacturing base is, what your purchasing power is. How do you have a consumer economy, as we are, when consumers don't have enough money to consume? So, a lot of the assumptions that underlie the current economic thinking are bogus. They don't work anymore. And so Yellen and others are sitting there saying, well, we've done our due diligence and we've gone through the algorithms and we've concluded that we can raise interest rates and unwind our holdings and treasuries and other financial paper, and all will be fine. Well, these are the same people who denied irrational exuberance in the Clinton era and then saw the dot-com bubble pop in 2000. They're the people who missed the 2008 crisis. They're the same people. Most of the people in the Federal Reserve System are either long-term employees of the Fed or people who came from the large money center banks. And they don't know the interests of the real economy. They know the interests of the banks. And so I think that we're all going to be in for a huge shock at some point because they don't know what they're doing.
And at this point, you don't think there's anything that Trump can do with the economy to stop this?
Well, I think there is.
Is there time?
Sure. There's not much time, but you better move quickly, just like he has to move on the strategic front. The important thing to do is the first thing you have to do is say there's not going to be another bailout. Therefore, we're going to go back with Glass-Steagall. And those of you who are sitting there on top of trillions of dollars of derivatives, you're going to have to work it out on your own. No bailout, no bail-in. You need a little time to do it? Fine. But we're not going to recognize the face value of the financial instruments that you're reporting on your books because they're fraudulent. Now, if you do that as a start, then it's going to rile up Wall Street to no end. They're going to go crazy. But you have to do that because they're destroying what's left of the real economy of the United States. Now, once you do that, and you make the commercial banks cut their links with the shadow banking system completely and with investment banks and turn them back into the old-fashioned so-called boring banking, well, it's not so boring. You figure out how to get credit through these banks so they can start investing in areas of physical production. And to really push that ahead, this is where infrastructure comes in. Infrastructure is not pork barrel or boondoggles. If you have an improved infrastructure, it has a ripple effect through the whole economy in terms of improving productivity. And you look at the bottlenecks we have now on transportation, the problems in energy, all of that could be solved with a competent infrastructure plan similar to what China's doing. So if you do that, you start to increase the value added to the economy and you dry up the so-called liquidity from the funny money. And it means you're probably going to have to, at some point, have a plan to get rid of the Federal Reserve System because it doesn't work. It works for the Federal Reserve System, but it doesn't work for the American people. So there's some things he can do quickly to stop the speculation, dry it up, and put money into real physical production. And that's pretty much what the Chinese have done. And with all the problems in China politically, the new reports coming out from Price Waterhouse and others are saying that they're not in a credit bubble. They're actually increasing the total productivity of the economy and the produced wealth, the value added production to their economy. That's what you want. And that's what we could do if we didn't have to deal with these speculators and swindlers.
Wait, you just said that China is not in a credit bubble?
They're letting they're actually dealing with the credit bubble in the right way. They're jailing some bankers, and they're moving the credit into physical production. And this is where the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, they're creating a lot of credit, but it's not based on what the Federal Reserve is doing. They're making the credit go to work producing something. And that way you actually can increase the overall real GDP so that you can reduce the credit bubble over time. And they're letting the air out of the bubble. That's the reports that are coming out from people who are studying this now.
And here in the United States, what do we have?
We're doing the opposite.
Okay, we're doing the opposite here.
We're scaling back the physical economy. We're losing manufacturing. We're down almost 7 million manufacturing jobs since 2000. Those were jobs that paid $60, $70 an hour. They're replaced with jobs that are part-time, low wage, and temporary. We're losing our ability to produce the goods that we consume. And we're told that's a good thing, that we're moving into a service economy or an information technology economy. But you still need roads. You still need transportation. You still need power. You still need food. There are a lot of things we need that we're no longer producing. And we're substituting American production with cheap labor from poor nations. And that's what the whole free trade policy was, to jack up corporate wealth.
And you're talking about that was the TPP?
TPP, yeah, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, although all of the globalization was based on this idea that we're going to somehow uplift other countries by sending them our industry without even thinking about what does that mean for the majority of the American workforce. And they didn't care. That's the point, Dave. They didn't care. And the voters saw that in Hillary Clinton and reacted to it.
So the plan that Trump has now, where he was out, from the very, very beginning saying that, these manufacturers, they're going to be coming back to the U.S., they're going to be building plants. None of this has really happened. It was a lot of press, but it actually didn't happen.
No, and to make it happen, you've got to shut down the tax havens. You've got to address all the shadow banking operations that have grown up under the deregulated banking system. There are a number of things you have to do, but they're all not so difficult. You start with Glass-Steagall. Then you can use tax policy to the old investment tax credit of John F. Kennedy. If someone's going to create jobs, you give them a tax credit. If they're going to do something that's good for the economy, you encourage it. If they're going to do something that's going to be good for their stockholders or for their senior bondholders, you question that. I don't know if you saw the interview with Jack Ma that he did with, what's his name, the PBS guy. But it was very interesting because he kept emphasizing that companies that put their customers first and their employees second and their shareholders third, that's what he's doing with his company, with Alibaba. And that used to be what we did in this country. That was the whole approach of Henry Ford with the Model T and you produce a product that your employees can afford. Right. So we've lost that. We've lost that idea of physical production in this country. And it's been replaced by these fancy quantification theories, these algorithms that can do one thing, which is create a bubble and enable the people who are salespeople within the bubble to make profits.
So if Trump, his biggest obstacle is, of course, the Federal Reserve. It's the individuals in Congress where, a lot of them are not working for the people. They're working for corporate interests. They're working for foreign governments. They're working for other entities. They're not going to really work with him. You can see it already that they're not going to.
No, not at all. And look, they're the ones funding the Get Trump, the Never Trump operations. And as I said, it's in both parties. You have someone like Jeb Hensarling, the head of the Finance Committee of the House, who said no to Glass-Steagall. We've got to go with this Financial Choice Act, which is basically completely remove any regulation on the big banks. And Hensarling, of course, I don't know if people know this, but he's a protege of Phil Gramm. And Gramm was the guy who wrote the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that got rid of Glass-Steagall, and then the Commodities Future Modernization Act, which flooded the banks with derivatives. So we've got these people who function on behalf of Wall Street, of the City of London, of the 12 largest banks in the world, who are the ones writing the legislation. Now, Trump knows that, and he's got to crack down on that. And the only way to do it is go over the head of Congress to the people and call on the people to come out and support these policies. And, I think he won an election by doing that, and now he's got to follow through with it.
I'm just going to ask you this. Do you think if he lets the economy completely crash, he can turn around and say, listen, this was what the Fed did. This is what Congress did. This is the approach that we took over the many years. Now we have to change it. Look where it brought us.
Well, that's one option. And the problem is that if you have a crash, another crash like 2008, without the ability to bail it out, because this time we wouldn't have the ability to do what was done last time. Not that what was done last time was good, but you risk having total chaos. Lots of people suffer and die, and it's not sure that he'd be able then to dictate the terms of the change. And that's why what Mr. LaRouche keeps emphasizing is he's got to be ahead of the curve. He's got to go out there and explain, we need Glass-Steagall because we don't want swindlers to benefit from taking the bread off your table. He's got to be direct like that and fight like hell for a few policies that will have a huge effect. And the one thing he's done that on is this question of working with Russia against terrorism. And he's also, to some extent, made the overtures and the offers to work with the Chinese on global infrastructure, provided the Chinese will have some room for American corporations, and the Chinese are doing that. So these are two areas where he's shown that he has a fairly sophisticated sense of what can be done and the courage to follow through. But he cannot ignore the enemies at home who don't want him to touch the economy.
Yeah, that's my biggest worry, is that the enemies at home, they like the system. They like receiving, the funds and making a lot of money. They don't want this to end.
Including in his own home. I don't trust Kushner very much.
True. And
he's been the conduit for some of these neocons in the intelligence community, and also for people like Mnuchin and Gary Cohn. So the Goldman boys.
Yeah. So where are we going with all this? To me, it seems like the clock is ticking down right now. And to me, when I look at the economy, it's deteriorating as we move, further into this year.
I think you're right about that. And I think that's why he's got to come back from the G20 and sit down with a couple of people he trusts and put together a plan to push through Glass-Steagall. It means he should work with the Democrats on Glass-Steagall, the ones who want to work with him, as well as some of the Republicans who want to do it. Remember, it's in the Republican presidential platform, restoring Glass-Steagall. And then from there, he's got to hammer out an infrastructure policy, and he's going to have to throw out Wall Street. He's going to have to say, I meant it when I said you guys aren't going to loot the American people anymore. You're on your own. No help. In fact, we're going to stop the things that you do that have harmed the economy in the past. And if he were to do that and do that consistently and tweet about that and go on television and talk about that, I think he'd pull the people behind him.
I agree. I think he would. I think he would pull the people along with what he wants to do, because he's showing them that, hey, I said I was going to do it. We're doing it, and we're trying to, make America great again. And I think he spends a little too much time with CNN and the corporate fake news. I understand that he's calling them out on it to let America know that, they're not telling the truth. And of course, for us, we know that the corporate media, they're getting their stories from intelligence agencies. They don't do, investigative reporting anymore, and they just push out fake information.
But investigative reporting these days is you take the latest leak from Mueller or Comey and you run it as a lead story. That's what the Washington Post is doing every day.
But I think there's going to become a point where, okay, we've let the public know about fake news. Now we need to take this to the next step, because to me, I don't know if he has that much time left to turn this economy around. We've never really been in a recovery. It's been this illusionary stimulus fakeness, just like the corporate media, and it's like coming to an end right now.
Well, time is certainly a problem. And the other problem is to make sure there's clarity. And the clarity comes from understanding who are the people who are responsible for the mess we're in, and what is their intention. And, it's one thing to start talking about the Rothschilds and the Illuminati and everything else. It's another thing to go out there and start naming the names and going after them. And I think people like Jamie Dimon and Blankfein and the people on the Federal Reserve, Dudley, the head of the Federal Reserve of New York, which is really nothing but a clearinghouse for the New York City banks, they have to be named and identified and called on the carpet. You have to do the same thing with some of the congressmen who for years have been doing the bidding of the banks. And, if you have the courage to do that and the clarity of a vision as to what can be done, you can pull the American people along with you. And, certainly Trump has shown some courage and he's shown an ability to fight back. But I agree with you, instead of body slamming CNN, he should do that to some of his Republicans in Congress.
I just want to say one thing. If he starts calling all these people out, like Jamie Dimon and different, that's where I believe the assassination part might come in.
Well, absolutely. And that may be a consideration on his part, because there has been a level of violent attack against him that if this were going on against Obama, the media would have been going crazy. But, the Julius Caesar play and Shakespeare in the Park in New York, Johnny Depp, Madonna burned down the White House. You have some real provocations for violence against Trump. And, we don't know how many people the Secret Service has picked up who, are walking around with guns somewhere in the vicinity of the White House. So he's got to have his security. But one of the things that provides security is to name those who might assassinate you before it happens. Identify the networks that are coming after you and just say, I want the people to know if anything happens to me, these are the guys you should be looking at. The Comeys, the John Brennans. These are the killers. They've killed before. And they're against me because I'm acting for you. He's got to do that.
It'd be great if he could do this. It'd be fantastic if he takes that path. But where do you, from this point on, where do you think we are headed with all this? How is it going to play out?
The thing people should realize is there already has been a shift globally away from this old paradigm, away from the old geopolitics. That's what the China, Russia, India alliance is doing. The highest growth rates in the world right now are China and India. And they're not doing it with funny money. They're doing it with production. So we're beginning to see a shift away from the speculative Wall Street, City of London control. Now, that's why they're so hysterical. If they lose the United States, they're finished. And this is where the battle is right now. So I think the real patriotic American should take heart in the fact that the world is moving to reject the Obama policy, the Bush policy, the Wall Street policy. The world is moving out from under that. I was just at a conference the other day on Africa, and the head of the African Union was up in front of a large group of German industrialists and bankers. And he said, we want your help in building our country, but we don't want you to come in and lecture us. We're not your servants. We want you to look us in the eye and treat us with respect. And then he said, the Chinese are doing that, and you Europeans are not. Now, that takes a lot of guts, but what we're seeing in Africa is some of the countries in Africa are 6, 8, 10% rate of growth. They're building high-speed rails now between Djibouti and Dakar, and we can't build a high-speed rail in the United States. So the world is moving, it's changing, and America is going to become irrelevant. We're going to collapse as a civilization unless we make these changes. And we, as you said, Dave, I agree with you completely. Time is short on this. So we better get to work on it now.
Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I appreciate it. Once again, how can people see your work?
Best place to go is larouchepack.com. And I've been writing some articles. I think a number of your listeners had asked me to see the last article. If people want to get another article, I'll do it one more time because I haven't set up my Facebook account yet. But if people want to see something from me, you can send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. I'll send you one of the most recent articles, and if you want to stay in touch after that, we'll have a mechanism to do it.
Great. Harley, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I appreciate it.